The morning Nora Calloway drove 4 hours to attend her great-aunt's estate reading, she had exactly $11.62 in her checking account, a tank of gas she had put on a credit card that was already $600 over its limit, and a daughter sitting in the back seat eating the last of a sleeve of crackers she had found behind the passenger seat. Clara was 9 years old and had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn mouth, and she was pressing her nose against the car window, watching the Tennessee hills roll past as though she had never seen anything so beautiful, which, Nora reflected, she probably hadn't. Their world for the past 7 months had been a stretch of motel rooms, no wider than a hallway, and a parking lot outside a Dollar General, where Nora worked the 6 to 2 shift, and she had not wanted to come. When the letter arrived from the law office of Beaumont and Associates in Harlins Creek, Tennessee, informing her that she had been named as a beneficiary in the last will and testament of one Edna Mae Hargrove, née Calloway, aged 91 years at the time of her passing, Nora had read it standing in the motel parking lot in the February cold, wearing her Dollar General vest, and felt nothing so much as a faint, bewildered grief. She had liked Edna May, had liked her in the specific way you could like someone you barely knew, but sensed, instinctively, was operating on a frequency most people couldn't hear. The old woman had lived alone in a small house in Harlins Creek her entire adult life, had never married, had kept a garden that everyone in town agreed was something to see in the summer, and had spoken to her extended family in the infrequent, careful way of someone who had learned that most words were wasted on most people. Nora had visited her 4 times in the last decade, 4 times in 10 years, which was 4 more times than any of her cousins had managed. She had written letters in between the visits, actual letters in actual envelopes, because Edna May had no computer and no interest in acquiring one, and the old woman had written back in a hand that was cramped but precise, full of observations about the weather and the state of her tomatoes, and small philosophical asides that Nora had found herself thinking about for days afterward. There had been a warmth in those letters that felt different from warmth extended out of obligation or politeness. It felt genuine in the way that rare things are genuine, and the way that certain silences between 2 people are more intimate than any conversation. But grief was a luxury Nora could not afford at the moment, and the letter had specified that her presence at the estate reading was required for her to claim whatever had been left to her. And so here she was, driving into the hills with $11.62 and a daughter eating crackers and the faint, terrible hope that Edna May had maybe, just maybe, left her something that mattered. She had not shared that hope with anyone. She had learned by then that hope was something you kept very quiet. The law office of Beaumont and Associates occupied the ground floor of a brick building on Main Street in Harlins Creek that also housed a dentist and a real estate office. The parking lot when Nora pulled in at 10:45 in the morning was already full of cars she recognized. Her cousin Derek's black pickup truck, clean as a showroom floor, the kind of truck a man buys when he wants to announce something. Her Aunt Patricia's silver sedan with the church parking sticker on the rear windshield, a rental car that she assumed belonged to Renee, her cousin on the other side of the family, who lived in Charlotte now and worked in finance, and called home twice a year at Christmas and Easter, and considered this fulfillment of her familial obligations complete. There were 3 other cars she didn't recognize. She sat in the parking lot for a moment, with the engine idling. Clara had fallen asleep somewhere around the last hour of the drive, and her head was tipped sideways against the window, and her mouth slightly open, the cracker sleeve clutched in one hand. Nora watched her daughter breathe and felt the familiar compound of love and terror that had become the baseline texture of her life since Marcus left, since the eviction, since the particular Tuesday in October when she had stood in an empty apartment holding Clara's hand and looked around at bare walls and thought, with a clarity that was almost peaceful in its devastation, that this was what rock bottom felt like. This was the floor. She had been wrong about it being the floor. There had been further to fall. But she had found, in the months since, that she was still standing. She smoothed her hair in the rearview mirror, put on the only blazer she owned, and gently woke her daughter. The conference room inside Beaumont and Associates was the kind of room designed to impress people who were already somewhat impressed by themselves, with dark wood paneling and a long table polished to a mirror shine, and chairs upholstered in something that was probably leather or trying hard to be. The Calloway relatives were already arranged around the table when Nora arrived with Clara, and the specific quality of the silence that greeted them was the kind that forms in the half-second before people decide how they are going to behave. Nora had not seen most of these people in 3 years. They had the look of people who had been gathered by obligation and were making the best of it by performing a warmth they did not particularly feel. Derek, her cousin, was in his early 40s, with the solid, well-fed look of a man who had made a success of his father's construction business and knew it and considered it a moral achievement. He gave Nora a brief nod of the type extended to people who were tolerated. His wife Linda sat beside him with a smile that was very precisely calibrated to convey sympathy without actually meaning it. Patricia, her father's sister, was 67 and dressed as though attending a church function, which for her was any gathering of more than 3 people. She glanced at Clara and then at Nora, with the expression she had worn at every family occasion Nora could remember, the expression of someone cataloging evidence of another person's failure. Patricia had opinions about Nora, had always had opinions about Nora, had expressed them at Thanksgivings and Christmases, and the occasional phone call, with the persistence of a person who believed that withholding opinions was a form of dishonesty. Renee, in the rental car from Charlotte, had the polished efficiency of someone who had places to be after this. She was in her late 30s and beautiful in a precise, maintained way, and she smiled at Nora with genuine warmth that was nonetheless brief, the warmth of someone who liked you well enough but was already calculating the drive time to the airport. There were 2 other cousins Nora knew less well, Jimmy and his sister Darla, who operated a hardware store in the next county, and who had the comfortable look of people whose lives had gone approximately as planned. And there was a woman Nora didn't know at all, a second cousin twice removed named Beverly, who had been located through a genealogy search and who sat at the far end of the table with the slightly stunned expression of someone who had not expected to be here and wasn't entirely sure what the correct behavior was. The lawyer, a man named Gerald Beaumont, who was in his late 50s and wore reading glasses on a chain, welcomed them all and poured water and arranged papers with the practiced efficiency of someone who had conducted this particular kind of gathering many times and understood its emotional architecture. People came in wanting things. They left having received less than they expected or more than they deserved. And the lawyer's job was to be very precise about which was which. He began with the property, The house on Sycamore Lane had been assessed at $92,000. It was to be sold, the proceeds split equally among the named beneficiaries after the settlement of any outstanding debts. There were no outstanding debts. Edna May, it turned out, had owned the house free and clear since 1978. There was a savings account, $14,000 and some change, to be divided equally. There was a car, a 2003 Buick LeSabre with 42,000 miles on it, assessed at $3,800, which went to Jimmy, who smiled and looked like he had not expected that. There was China, a full service for 12 in a pattern called Royal Doulton Countess, assessed at $1,200, which went to Derek, who looked at this as though it were satisfactory, but not impressive. His wife Linda brightened visibly and began, like immediately, doing quiet arithmetic in her head about which cabinet it would go in. There was jewelry, a pearl necklace and matching earrings, assessed at $1,100. These went to Renee, who accepted them with a gracious nod and placed the small envelope in her handbag with the practiced ease of someone who regularly received gifts. There were other items. A quilt, documented as hand-stitched and belonging to Edna May's grandmother, which went to Beverly, who looked genuinely moved. A set of silver-handled flatware in an oak box, assessed at $800, which went to Darla. A collection of first-edition books, assessed collectively at $400, which went to Patricia, who looked like she considered this appropriate. Gerald Beaumont adjusted his reading glasses and continued down the list. And then he said Nora's name. She sat up slightly in her chair. Clara, beside her, had been drawing shapes on a notepad she had brought, and she looked up at the sound of her mother's name. To my great-niece, Nora Christine Calloway, the lawyer read, I leave the steamer trunk in the upstairs bedroom, along with all its contents. There was a pause. The steamer trunk in the upstairs bedroom. Nora waited for something else. For a secondary item, a bank account, a piece of land, the kind of supplementary detail that would make the steamer trunk part of something larger. But Gerald Beaumont had moved on to Beverly and a small cash bequest, and there was nothing else with Nora's name attached to it. The steamer trunk. She became aware, with the particular hyper-awareness of humiliation, that the people around her were looking at their own documents, or at the table, or at their hands, doing the specific thing people do when they don't want to be caught, witnessing something uncomfortable. The exceptions were Derek, who was looking at her with an expression she recognized as the barely suppressed satisfaction of someone who has just had a favorable comparison made for them, and his wife Linda, who was doing the kindest thing she could manage, which was pretending to examine the China documentation very closely. It was Patricia who spoke first. Well, she said. Her voice carried the gentle implacability of a woman who believed her observations were valuable. The estate appraiser assessed the trunk at $30. Patricia let that sit for a moment. $30. Like a period at the end of a sentence. Darla, who was not a cruel person but was not a careful one either, said something quietly to her brother Jimmy that Nora couldn't hear, and Jimmy made a small sound that might have been a laugh suppressed. Renee was looking at her phone, which was perhaps the most cutting response of all, the suggestion that the revelation was not interesting enough to merit attention. Nora sat very still. She had a long practice of sitting still when things hurt, had developed it in childhood and refined it in the years since. It was not the stillness of indifference. It was the stillness of a person who has learned that reactions give other people information, and information in the hands of people who don't wish you well is a kind of power over you. She had given that power away too many times. She had stopped giving it away. $30, she said, and her voice was level. That's fine. She could feel Clara looking at her. The child had stopped drawing and was watching her mother's face with the careful, calibrated attention of a child who has learned to read adults very well, who has become expert at the particular skill of measuring how bad things are before anyone says they are bad. Nora reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand under the table once, and returned her attention to Gerald Beaumont, who was finishing the reading with the smooth professionalism of a man who had navigated far worse family dynamics than this. After the reading, in the parking lot, while the relatives clustered in small groups with the slightly released energy of people who had completed an obligation and were now free to talk about it, Nora loaded Clara into the car and sat for a moment with her hands on the steering wheel. Derek appeared at her window. He had the look of someone performing generosity. "We could just take it off your hands," he said, "if you don't want to make the drive back with it." Derek made a wide gesture with one hand that was meant to suggest this was purely for her convenience and had nothing to do with the fact that he had assessed the situation and concluded that an old steamer trunk might contain something worth having. He was the type of man who had never quite grown out of believing that resources naturally accrued to people like him. Nora looked at him for a long moment. "I'll manage," she said. He shrugged with the practiced ease of a man who does not experience rejection, as rejection so much as the temporary non-arrival of something he will receive eventually. "Sure," he said. "Offer stands." She watched him walk back to his truck, and then she put the car in reverse. The house on Sycamore Lane had the particular quality of emptiness that follows the removal of a life. The furniture was still there, waiting for the estate sale, but the objects that had made it a home, the books on the shelves, the photographs on the walls, the small accumulations of a particular person's particular attention to the world, had already been claimed or catalogued, and the house had responded to their absence by becoming generic, by becoming simply a structure rather than a place where someone had lived. Nora had been here 4 times, and she carried those visits in her memory with the specificity of things you know you will not have again. The smell of Edna May's kitchen, which had been coffee, and something herbal she couldn't name. The sound of the old woman's voice, low and dry and precise. The garden in June, which had been extraordinary. Raised beds in perfect geometrical order. Everything labeled in Edna May's careful handwriting. Everything in its right place. She stood in the hallway and let herself feel the grief for a moment. Let it be real. Then she went upstairs. The bedroom was small and spare. A single bed with a white coverlet, a dresser with a mirror, a window with white curtains that let in the particular soft light of a February afternoon. And in the corner, under the window, the steamer trunk. It was large. That was the first thing she registered. It seemed large enough that she had an immediate practical concern about getting it down the stairs and into her car. The exterior was covered in what had once been canvas, now worn to a kind of mineral gray, patterned with travel stickers that had faded to illegibility, except for one that read Paris and another that might have said London or Lisbon. It was impossible to tell anymore. The hardware, the clasps and hinges and corner reinforcements, was tarnished brass that had gone almost black. The whole thing had the look of an object that had been somewhere and seen things, and was not going to be hurried about explaining itself. She knelt in front of it and unlatched the clasps. They resisted at first, seized with time, and then gave with a sound like a held breath being released. The lid lifted, and the smell that came out was something she had no precise word for. Old cloth, lavender, long faded to a ghost of itself, cedar, and underneath all of it, something else, something faint and dry and ancient that she associated, for reasons she couldn't articulate, with things that had been carefully kept. On top, folded with a precision that bordered on the ceremonious, was a wool coat. Navy blue, or it had been navy blue once. The color faded to something between blue and gray. The fabric still good, a quality of material that you didn't encounter much anymore. Beneath the coat, more clothing. A dress with a small floral print, the kind of dress that suggested the wearer had believed in the importance of being properly dressed for ordinary occasions. A blouse with pearl buttons, a pair of gloves, all of it folded with that same precise care. The care of a person who understood that things kept well lasted longer than things kept carelessly. Nora lifted the coat and held it for a moment. It was heavier than it should have been, heavy enough that she noticed it. The weight distributed in a way that didn't quite correspond to just wool. She set it aside and kept looking. Beneath the clothing was a layer of old newspapers. They were yellow and brittle and dated from the 1960s, and they had been laid flat, arranged like a protective layer, insulating whatever lay below them from the world above. Nora lifted them with care, setting them aside in a stack. They were dated 1962, 1963, 1964. The headlines were from another world, a world that had seemed, in that moment, or like it might be on the verge of becoming something entirely different, for better or worse. Under the newspapers was a layer of white tissue paper, the kind used to wrap delicate things, the kind you associate with objects whose importance is understood by the person doing the wrapping. Nora's hands had slowed. She was aware that Clara was standing in the doorway behind her, watching with that child's watchfulness, and she was aware that the light in the room was dimming slightly as the afternoon moved, and she was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she hadn't been a few minutes ago. She lifted the tissue paper. Beneath it were three things, arranged with the deliberateness of objects, placed rather than packed. A leather-bound ledger, its cover dark with age, a small brass key on a piece of red ribbon, and a cream-colored envelope with her name on it. Not her full name, just Nora. Written in the cramped, precise handwriting she recognized from the letters Edna May had sent her over the years. She sat back on her heels. Outside the window, a bird called once, and then went quiet. She did not open the envelope, not yet. Something in her, some instinct she could not have named, told her that the envelope was a conclusion to something, that it belonged at the end of a sequence she hadn't completed yet. She set it carefully on the white coverlet of the bed, then picked up the ledger. The leather was soft in a way that suggested it had been handled frequently. She opened it to the first page, and the date there was March 14th, 1956, and below the date, in handwriting, she recognized these words. For the purpose of record, I'm Edna Mae Calloway Hargrove. This book contains an account of certain matters about which I prefer to say nothing aloud. Nora turned to the next page and began to read. What followed was not a diary in any conventional sense. There were no entries about feelings or daily events, or the kind of personal accounting that most people use a private journal for. What it was, instead, was exactly what Edna May had called it: a record. Dates and numbers and names, entries made in that careful hand, with the precision of someone who understood that precision was a form of respect for what was being documented. The first entries were from 1956 and 1957. Small amounts: $50, $75, $120. Each entry was followed by a name: IBM Corporation, American Telephone and Telegraph, the Coca-Cola Company, Standard Oil of New Jersey, and beside each name, in smaller writing, the number of shares acquired. Nora turned pages. The entries continued through the years with a steady, unhurried rhythm. More shares, different companies. Sometimes the entries were accompanied by brief notations. Split occurred. Reinvested dividend. Added to position. The language of someone who had been doing this a long time and had developed a private shorthand for it. The entries went on through the 60s, through the 70s, through the 80s, where the amounts began to change, where the notations became more frequent and carried a different quality, the quality of compounding, of something small growing large by the simple mechanism of time applied to patience. Through the 90s, through the early 2000s. The last entry in the ledger was dated September 3rd, 2019, 4 years before Edna May died. The final notation was brief: transferred to custodial account per arrangement with Beaumont. All certificates and documentation in trunk per original plan. Status: complete. Nora sat for a long time in the dimming light of her great-aunt's bedroom, with the ledger open on her knees. Clara had come to sit beside her on the floor, drawn by her mother's stillness, leaning slightly against her arm with the easy trust of a child who has learned that her mother's silences are usually worth waiting through. She did not yet fully understand what she was reading. The numbers in the ledger were not translated into present-day values. They were historical records of purchases, of shares, of things acquired. And Nora's knowledge of the stock market was the knowledge of someone who had never had enough money to participate in it, which is to say, she knew it existed, and that other people used it, and that it was the kind of thing people with money did with their money. And beyond that, her understanding was general at best. But she was not a careless reader. She was, in fact, a precise one, the kind of person who reads everything twice and notices the things most people skip. And what she had noticed, turning these pages in this order, was the accumulation. The way the entries across 60 years told a story, not about a poor woman living alone in a small house in rural Tennessee, but about something else entirely. About a person who had been, for 6 decades, doing something very quiet and very specific and very consistent. She turned to the front of the ledger again. The first entry: $50. IBM Corporation, 1956. She turned to the last entry: 2019. She thought about what IBM Corporation's stock had done between 1956 and 2019. She didn't know the precise numbers, but she knew enough. She had read enough, absorbed enough from the years of living in a world where other people's wealth was a constant background noise, to know that it was not a small thing. She thought about the Coca-Cola Company, about American Telephone and Telegraph, about Standard Oil of New Jersey, which had become something else eventually, had become Exxon, which had become something enormous. She thought about dividends reinvested over 60 years, about stock splits, about the kind of compounding that happens when you leave something alone and let time do what time does. And she was very still. Then she picked up the leather ledger and the cream-colored envelope and the small brass key, and she carried them downstairs to where the light was better, to where she could sit at the kitchen table that Edna May had sat at for 60 years, and she opened the envelope. The letter inside was 3 pages, written on the same lined paper Edna May had used for her letters over the years, in the same cramped and precise handwriting. It began without preamble, the way Edna May had always written, without the social lubrication of small talk, as though there were things to be said, and the saying of them should not be delayed. Nora, it said. By the time you read this, I will be gone, which is the natural order of things, and nothing to mourn too much. And I am leaving you the trunk, because you are the only one of them who ever came to see me without wanting something. I am an old woman, and I have had a long time to observe people, and I know the difference. Nora's throat tightened. She kept reading. I never spoke about my finances to anyone. This was a deliberate decision made a long time ago, and I have never regretted it. I watched money do damage to my family when I was young, and I decided early that the best use of money was to keep it quiet and let it work and not make anyone else aware of it, because awareness leads to expectation, and expectation leads to the particular kind of ugliness I watched destroy my own parents' generation. Oh, I want to explain what you have received so that you understand it clearly, and don't make the mistake of thinking it is small or manageable or something to be easily explained away. In 1951, I was engaged to be married to a man named Robert Hargrove, who was the finest person I ever knew. Robert was killed in Korea in November of that year. He had a $50,000 life insurance policy, of which I was the named beneficiary, which was a significant sum in 1951, and which I received in 1952 after the Army's administrative process ran its course. I did not spend it. I had no use for it, and I had no heart for spending it on myself. But I am a practical woman, and a practical woman does not let things sit idle. I began investing in 1952 with the help of a broker in Knoxville named Harold Fitch, and who was an honest man and the only broker I ever trusted, which is saying something about brokers in general. Harold's advice was simple, and he repeated it to me every time I saw him for 30 years. Buy good companies, reinvest everything, and never sell in a panic. I followed this advice exactly. I am not going to tell you the precise value of what you have received, because I don't know the exact current figure, and because I believe it is better for you to discover it yourself, to see it in real numbers from a real institution rather than from my handwriting on a page. But I will tell you that it is not small. It is not the kind of sum that solves a problem. It is the kind of sum that changes what problems are possible. The custodial account was established at First National Bank of Tennessee in Beaumont's name as trustee, to be transferred to you upon my death. Gerald Beaumont has the paperwork and will process the transfer with proper documentation. This will take some weeks. The trunk itself contains the original stock certificates from before the account was established, which are now largely redundant, but which I kept for reasons of sentiment, and certain other items I want you to have regardless of their monetary value. There is a coat at the top of the trunk. Look at the lining of the coat. Nora set the letter down on the table. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table and her eyes on the grain of the wood. Then she stood up and went back upstairs. The coat was where she had left it, folded on the floor beside the trunk. She picked it up and turned it over in her hands, and then, moving slowly, She examined the lining. The lining was silk, or had been silk, a dark blue that had faded to the color of deep water. She ran her hands along it and felt immediately what she had not felt when she had simply lifted the coat and felt its unexpected weight. A rigidity in the fabric, a structure beneath the softness that did not belong to cloth alone. She found the seam. It had been restitched, not professionally but carefully, the stitches smaller and closer than the original. The thread matched, but not quite matched. Someone had opened this lining and then sewn it closed again. She went back downstairs to find scissors in the kitchen drawer. Clara was at the table now, reading the letter without permission, and Nora let her, because Clara was 9 and perceptive, and there was nothing in the letter that should be hidden from her, nothing that should make her feel she wasn't part of whatever this was. Nora used the small scissors she found in the third drawer to carefully open the seam. She worked slowly, cutting thread by thread, the way you do when you want to keep the fabric intact, when you sense that the person who made this did not do it carelessly, and that the undoing of it should be done with equivalent care. The lining folded back. In the space between the lining and the wool, flat and protected by decades of stillness, lay a row of slim cloth pouches, each one tied with a length of silk ribbon. There were 7 of them. Nora untied the first one with fingers that had gone very steady, the specific steadiness that comes when the ordinary biological response to excitement is overridden by the more fundamental biological response to understanding that something real is happening. Inside the first pouch, wrapped in a square of tissue paper that crinkled as she opened it, were 4 rings. 3 of them were set with stones that she recognized, even in the faded winter light of the kitchen, as diamonds. Not small ones, not modest ones. The 4th ring was a deep blue that she thought, though she wasn't certain, was sapphire, mounted in a setting that was old and intricately made, and wore the quality of its age like something earned rather than merely happened. Clara, beside her, said nothing. She was looking at the rings with the absolute still attention of a child encountering something outside the categories available to her. Nora opened the second pouch. More stones, different settings, a brooch with a cluster of smaller diamonds in a starburst pattern that caught the kitchen light and scattered it across the ceiling in points. A necklace with what appeared to be emeralds, the green of them so deep and saturated that they looked, in the dim kitchen, almost like pieces of the ocean brought into a solid state. The third pouch held coins. Old coins, not the kind you find in a jar on a dresser, but the kind in protective sleeves, labeled, documented, the kind that told a story about a person who understood their value and had taken care of them accordingly. There were 7 pouches. When Nora had opened all of them and laid their contents on the kitchen table, the table was covered in a way that transformed the kitchen entirely, that made the small room feel suddenly inhabited by something much larger than itself. The rings, the brooch, the necklace, the coins, 24 of them in their protective sleeves. Another necklace, this one pearls of such even quality and luster that they seemed lit from within. 3 bracelets, a set of earrings she recognized, without being able to explain precisely how she recognized them, as the kind of thing that belonged in a museum. She sat down. Clara sat down beside her. For a long time, neither of them said anything. Outside, the February light had gone the color of pewter, and the old house settled around them with the sound of wood contracting in the cold, a comfortable sound, an inhabited sound. Somewhere in town, A church bell rang the hour. Nora thought about the reading that morning, about the table of relatives with their china and their cash and their pearls and their satisfied arithmetic, about Derek's expression when she had been given the trunk, about Patricia's voice saying $30 with that particular inflection that made it something worse than money, made it a comment on Nora's worth in the family's ongoing accounting of who mattered. She thought about $11.62 in her checking account, and a motel room that smelled of industrial cleaner, and 7 months of Clara pretending that things were fine because her mother needed her to. She thought about Edna Mae Hargrove, née Calloway, who had sat at this table in this kitchen for 60 years and had kept her silence and her secrets and her extraordinary patient faith that the right person would eventually come to receive what she had prepared. She picked up the letter again and found where she had left off. "I am not sentimental about things," it continued in Edna May's precise hand. "But I want to tell you that the visits you made and the letters you wrote mattered to me more than you knew. You came because you were curious about me and you liked me, not because you expected anything, and that is rarer than people realize. Most people are only curious about what they can get. You were curious about what I thought and what I had seen, and who I had been. That is a different kind of curiosity, and it is the kind I respect. I hope this finds you when you need it most, and I imagine it will. You have always seemed to me to be a person who could use something to stand on while you figured out where to go. I hope this is that. Use it wisely. Don't tell the family until you are ready. And don't let them make you feel that you don't deserve it, because you do. And I say that not out of affection, though I feel affection, but out of the simple assessment of someone who has watched people for a very long time. You deserve it. Your great-aunt, Edna May." Nora set the letter down on the table. She looked at the contents of the coat's lining spread across the surface in front of her. She looked at the ledger with its 60 years of entries. She looked at the brass key on its red ribbon, which she hadn't yet tried in any lock, which belonged to something she hadn't yet found. She looked at her daughter. Clara was watching her with dark eyes that held the specific complex mixture of a child who is trying to understand what an adult's expression means, whether this is something to be afraid of or something to hope about, and who has learned from experience that the two can sometimes feel remarkably similar. "Mom," Clara said carefully, "what is it?" Nora looked at the jewelry on the table, at the ledger, at the letter in her hand. She took a breath. "I'm not sure yet," she said, "but I think it might be everything." The wind pushed against the old windows of Edna May's kitchen, and the February light faded toward dark, and Nora Calloway sat at her great-aunt's table with her daughter beside her, and the contents of an old steamer trunk spread before her, and the beginning of an understanding that was going to take a long time to become fully real, because the things that change your life rarely announce themselves all at once. They arrive in pieces, the way light arrives, incrementally, the way understanding arrives, not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of moments, each one adding to the last until you realize, without being able to say precisely when it happened, that you can see clearly. She was not yet to that clarity, but she was closer than she had ever been. She picked up the brass key on its red ribbon, and she held it in her palm, and she thought about what else the trunk had in it that she hadn't yet reached, about the letter's instruction to look at the lining of the coat, which she had done, and about what other instructions she might not yet have found, what other layers of this strange gift she had not yet uncovered. She thought about Gerald Beaumont and the custodial account, and the phrase that had lodged itself in her mind like a splinter she couldn't stop thinking about. The kind of sum that changes what problems are possible. She folded the letter and put it in the inside pocket of her blazer, close to her chest, the way you carry things you need to keep real. She looked at her daughter. "Are you hungry?" she asked. Clara considered this with the gravity she applied to all practical questions. "Yes," she said. "Also, what does custodial account mean?" "It means," Nora said, getting up to look in the kitchen cabinets, "that there is something else. Something we haven't found yet. Something that Edna May put somewhere for safekeeping." She opened the first cabinet and found nothing useful. She opened the second and found a box of tea and some crackers and a can of soup, the provisions of someone who had known they were at the end and had stopped buying in large quantities some months ago. She put the soup on the stove. Behind her, Clara sat with the brass key in her hands, turning it over in the way that children handle small, mysterious objects, with the full attention of someone who has not yet learned to pretend that things are less interesting than they are. "What does it open?" Clara asked. "I don't know yet," Nora said. But she had a feeling, in the particular way that you have feelings about things when you have been reading someone's mind across 60 years of handwritten records, that she was going to find out. And she had a feeling, which was newer and stranger and more fragile than anything else she was carrying in that moment, that when she did, nothing was going to look the same afterward. She stirred the soup and listened to the old house settle around them and thought about $30 and about what $30 could become in the hands of a woman who understood patience, and about what patience could do to a problem when it was given enough time and enough faith. Outside, the first stars were appearing over the Tennessee hills. The house was warm. Clara was humming something under her breath, the way she did when she was thinking. Nora let herself, very carefully, begin to hope. They did not go back to the motel that night. It was Clara who made the case for staying, or with the practical directness of a child who had learned that adults sometimes needed permission to do the obvious thing. The house was warm, she pointed out. There was food in the cabinet. The beds were still there. And it was a 4-hour drive home. And home was a motel room that smelled of industrial cleaner. And they had exactly $11.62 and a credit card that was already at its limit, and a tank of gas that would get them about halfway. These were facts. Clara delivered them without drama or performance, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands folded in front of her, a 9-year-old woman conducting a logical assessment of available options. The clarity of it made Nora want to cry, which she did not do, because she had learned that crying in front of Clara sent the child into a particular mode of fierce protective brightness that was exhausting to witness, because you knew what it cost her. "You're right," Nora said. "We'll stay." She found sheets in the linen closet off the hallway, folded in the same precise way as the clothing in the trunk, the same careful hand evident in the mitered corners. She made up the bed in the small spare room and put Clara in it with her stuffed rabbit and the crackers and a glass of water, and she sat on the edge of the bed until the child fell asleep, which happened quickly, the way it does when you're 9 years old and have been in a car for most of the day. Then she went back downstairs. The contents of the coat's lining were still on the kitchen table, and the ledger was open where she had left it, and the letter from Edna May was in the pocket of her blazer. She sat down at the table and turned the brass key over in her fingers and thought about what it opened. The key was small, the kind of key that did not belong to a house, or a padlock, or anything designed to keep people out. Its teeth were too fine for that, its shaft too slender. It had the look of a key that belonged to something precise, something intended for a specific purpose, the kind of key that was made to fit one lock and one lock only. The kind of key that banks issued. She went back to the ledger and read it again from the beginning. More slowly this time, reading it the way you read something when you're not just taking in the content, but trying to understand the person behind it, trying to hear the voice in the words even when the words are nothing but dates and numbers and company names. IBM Corporation, January 14th, 1956. 50 shares. $2.20 commission paid to H. Fitch, Harold Fitch, the broker in Knoxville, the only honest one Edna May had ever trusted. She turned pages. The entries for the first few years were modest. 50 here, 100 there. Amounts that suggested someone being careful rather than bold, someone building a habit more than a fortune. But the habit held. Through 1957, 1958, 1959. Every few months, another entry, another company, another small accumulation of shares, each one reinvested, each dividend rolled back into more shares, so the slow, patient machinery of compounding doing its work in the background, while Edna May tended her garden and wrote her letters, and went about the life that nobody outside this house had known was built on a foundation like this. She turned to the entries from the 1970s and noticed that the amounts had grown. Not because Edna May was spending more, but because the shares themselves had grown. Because dividends reinvested over 15 years had become something different than dividends reinvested over one. Because the machine had been running long enough to show what it could do. There were notations here she hadn't fully absorbed in the first reading. Split. 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 The same companies whose names she had seen in the early pages. But the share counts now followed by numbers that had changed in the way that numbers change when a company does well enough to divide itself, to give its investors more by multiplying what they held. IBM split twice in the 60s. She knew that much. Coca-Cola had split more times than she could count off the top of her head. AT&T had its own complicated history, had broken apart in the 80s, and reformed into things with different names, but the value hadn't disappeared. It had transformed, had become something else. But it had not evaporated. She was not a financial expert. She had never owned a stock in her life. But she had a functional intelligence, and she had read the entries in this ledger carefully enough to understand their trajectory. And the trajectory was one thing unmistakably. It went up. She turned to the last few pages, the entries from the 90s and early 2000s, and found a different kind of notation. Briefer, more summary in nature, less granular about individual transactions, and more focused on the account as a whole. Quarterly valuations listed. The figures beside them denominated in a range that, when she saw them, made her sit very still for a moment, and then go back and read them again. She read them a third time. She set the ledger down on the table, and she looked at the brass key, and she thought about Edna May sitting in this kitchen in 2003 and writing down a number that was larger than anything Nora had ever personally possessed, by a factor that was not easily absorbed at 11 o'clock at night, in a dead woman's kitchen on $11.62. She thought about the letter. The kind of sum that changes what problems are possible. That was one way to put it. She pulled the ledger close again and turned to the back cover, where she found something she had missed in the first reading. A pocket. A small paper pocket affixed to the inside of the back cover, the kind you find in library books for the card that tells you who borrowed it before you. Inside the pocket was a folded slip of paper, the same lined paper Edna May used for everything. Nora unfolded it carefully. 3 things were written on it, in the same precise hand. The first was the name of a bank. First National Bank of Tennessee, Harlan's Creek branch. The second was a number, Box 447. The third was a sentence. The key is in the letter. Nora blinked at that for a moment, then understood. The key is in the letter. Not the letter in the envelope, but the letter, the literal physical letter of her name, the first letter, the N that began Nora, written on the outside of the envelope that still sat on the kitchen table. She picked up the envelope and turned it over in her hands, and now she felt it. Very faint, a slight thickening in the paper itself, something incorporated into the bottom flap, beneath the seal that had already been opened. She peeled the flap back the rest of the way, and there, glued flat against the inside of the flap, pressed into the paper itself, was a single index card on which a number had been written in small, clean digits. The access code for the safe deposit box. Nora sat back in her chair. She thought about the extraordinary precision of all of this. The trunk in the upstairs bedroom, the coat at the top, the lining of the coat, the ledger, the envelope with her name on it, in handwriting she recognized. The letter inside the envelope that told her what to look for. The pocket in the back of the ledger that told her where to look. The key that she had had in her hand since the afternoon, waiting to be understood. Edna Mae Hargrove had been, in addition to everything else she had been, a woman who planned. A woman who constructed things with the patience and precision of someone who understood that the difference between a thing done and a thing done well was the attention paid to the sequence. She had laid out a path for Nora to walk, had marked it carefully, had trusted that the right person, given enough time and enough clues, would follow it to its end. Nora folded the index card into her palm and held it there, and outside the window, the Tennessee hills were dark, and the February stars were out, hard and clear and cold. And she thought about a woman who had loved a man named Robert Hargrove and lost him to a war in 1951, and had taken the money that came from that loss and turned it, with 60 years of patient attention, into this. She thought about what you did with a grief that large, how you metabolized it, whether you metabolized it or whether you simply found over time that you had built something around it, a life organized not around the absence, but around the question of what to do with the energy of it, where to put the force of a love that had nowhere to go. She thought about Edna May's garden, which everyone in Harlan's Creek agreed was something to see. She understood for the first time that the garden and the ledger were the same thing. She went to bed. Gerald Beaumont's office, when she arrived at 9 the next morning, with Clara, and the ledger, and the brass key, and the index card, and the full weight of a night in which she had slept approximately 3 hours, had the same dark-paneled composure it had possessed the day before. But it felt different now. She felt different now. The quality of light in the room seemed the same, the smell of old wood and coffee the same. But she was sitting in the same chair she had sat in yesterday, with a different orientation to the room, a different understanding of what she was doing here. Gerald Beaumont looked up from his desk when his assistant showed her in, and his expression underwent a small but perceptible change. He had been a lawyer long enough to read the people who walked into his office, to understand from the set of a person's face and the way they carried themselves whether they were coming with questions or with knowledge, whether they needed things explained to them or whether they had arrived at their own understanding and were here to have it confirmed. He looked at the ledger in her hands. "You found it," he said. He said it the way you say something when you have been waiting for a particular person to say a particular thing, and the wait is finally over. "You knew about the trunk," Nora said. This wasn't a question. Beaumont gestured for her to sit, and she sat, and Clara sat beside her with her notebook, drawing the bookshelves. "I knew about the trunk," he said. "Miss Hargrove was very specific about the estate distribution. I'll be honest with you, Miss Calloway. I've been doing this work for 31 years, and I have never been instructed to be as precise about what not to say as she instructed me. She did not want anything mentioned at the reading about the custodial account or its contents. She wanted you to find it yourself. She was very clear about that." "Why?" He considered the question with the care of a man choosing between several true answers. "She said," he began, and then paused, turning something over in his mind. "She said she wanted you to have the experience of finding it yourself, because finding it yourself would tell you something that being given it wouldn't. And she said she wanted to know, even if she wasn't here to see it, that you had gone through the whole thing, had read the letters, had followed the trail she left, and she wanted to give you not just the money, but the story of it." Nora absorbed this. She placed the ledger on his desk. "Can you tell me the current value?" she said, and her voice was steady. "Of the custodial account." Beaumont opened his desk drawer and withdrew a folder, which he laid on the desk between them and turned to face her. He opened it to the 3rd page and turned it so the number at the top of the page was facing her, and sat back in his chair to give her the space she might need to look at it. Nora looked at it. The number was in the header of a bank statement from First National Bank of Tennessee, dated the previous December. The account was labeled Hargrove Custodial. The balance line was at the top right of the page, printed in the ordinary way of bank statements, in the ordinary font, with no special emphasis, because it was, to the bank, simply a number of the type banks dealt in regularly. To Nora, it was something else. It was $2,341,812.17. She looked at it for a long time. Clara, who had stopped drawing and leaned over to look at what her mother was looking at, made a very small sound that was not quite a word. "The account also accrues quarterly dividends," Beaumont said, in the gentle voice of a man who has delivered significant information before and understands the importance of continuing to speak calmly, so that the person in front of him has something ordinary to anchor to. Current quarterly dividend income is approximately $11,000, based on the current portfolio composition. This will transfer to you upon completion of the estate process, which will take approximately 4 to 6 weeks for the full legal transfer. In the meantime, the account remains secured and continues to earn. Nora looked up from the page. "And the safe deposit box," she said. "Yes." He folded his hands on the desk. "That's separate from the account. The box contains the original stock certificates and certain personal documents Miss Hargrove wanted you to have. I have not had access to the box's contents. She held the only key. Well, she said you would have the key. Nora opened her hand and placed the brass key on the desk between them. Beaumont looked at it with an expression that was briefly and unmistakably something close to relief. "Let me call the bank," he said. The First National Bank of Tennessee in Harlan's Creek was a modest building on a corner 2 blocks from the law office, the brick fronted with a small awning and a parking lot that held 4 cars, including the bank manager's, which was a 10-year-old Civic with a Vanderbilt parking sticker. The inside smelled of industrial carpet, and the particular coolness of spaces kept at a regulated temperature, and the teller behind the counter was a young man who looked up when they came in with the alert expression of someone who is not usually visited by a lawyer and a woman carrying a ledger from 1956. The bank manager, a woman named Loretta Price, who was in her early 50s with reading glasses, pushed up on her head, and the practical warmth of someone who had worked in small-town banking long enough to have known most of her customers their whole lives, came out of her office to meet them. She shook Nora's hand and said that she had known Edna May for 30 years, and that she had been a quiet customer and a good one, and that she was sorry for the loss, and there was nothing performative about any of it. She led them to the vault room in the back, which was smaller than Nora had expected, lined with steel boxes of varying sizes in the way that vault rooms always are, the names and numbers on each box a kind of private census of the town's private concerns. Box 447 was in the second row from the floor, mid-sized, its face unmarked except for the number. Loretta inserted the bank's key. Nora inserted the brass key. They turned together. The box slid out with a soft metallic sound. Loretta left them with it, the way bankers do, with a discretion that was both professional and genuinely tactful, and Nora sat with Clara at the small table in the vault room and opened the box. Inside was a file folder, thick with paper, and on top of it a smaller envelope, this one sealed, with nothing written on the outside. Nora opened the file folder first. The original stock certificates were there, as Beaumont had said, dozens of them, each one a piece of heavy engraved paper with the formal decorative borders that stock certificates used to carry, the kind that looked like small pieces of official government, each one bearing the name of a company and a number of shares, and Edna Mae Calloway's name in a copperplate script, and dates going back to the 1950s. IBM Corporation, 40 shares. American Telephone and Telegraph, 60 shares. The Coca-Cola Company, 30 shares. Standard Oil of New Jersey, 25 shares. There were also more recent documents, account statements, transfer records, on a handwritten inventory in Edna May's writing that listed every holding and its purchase date and the current share count after splits, which was, in almost every case, a number dramatically larger than the original purchase. 30 shares of Coca-Cola purchased in 1957 had become, after splits documented through 2010, 960 shares. 25 shares of Standard Oil had become, through the Byzantine corporate evolution that had taken the company from its original form through its dissolution and reemergence as Exxon and then ExxonMobil, something that Nora was going to need significant professional help to fully understand. She set the file folder aside and opened the small sealed envelope. Inside was a photograph. It was a black and white photograph, the edges soft with age, the image slightly faded, but clear enough. Now a young man in a military uniform, standing in front of what appeared to be a garden. the same raised beds and careful geometry that Nora had seen in the photographs of Edna May's garden that still hung in the hallway of the house. He was handsome in the way of young men in that period, before everything became self-conscious about it, with an open, unguarded smile that suggested he was happy at the precise moment this was taken, that he had no particular awareness of the camera, that he was just a young man standing in a garden being happy. On the back, in handwriting that was not Edna May's, but older and lighter, and full of the looping script of another era, someone had written, "Robert, June 1950, before Korea." Below that, in Edna May's precise hand, added later, in different ink, "He would have liked you." Nora sat with the photograph for a long moment. Clara had come to look over her shoulder and was looking at the photograph with the serious attention she gave all things she didn't fully understand. "Who is he?" she asked. "A man named Robert Hargrove," Nora said. "He died in the Korean War. He was going to marry Edna May." Clara considered this. "So all the money came from him?" "Not exactly," Nora said. "It came from losing him, and from what she did with that loss." Clara thought about this for a while. "That's really sad," she said. And then, after a pause, "And also kind of amazing." "Yes," Nora said. "It is both of those things." She tucked the photograph carefully back into its envelope and added it to the ledger. And she sat in the vault room of the First National Bank of Tennessee with her daughter and a box full of 60 years of patient accumulation. And she let herself fully understand, for the first time, what she had been given. Not just the money, though the money was real and enormous and was going to change everything. The story of it, as Beaumont had said, as Edna May had intended. The story of a woman who had loved someone and lost him and had refused, for 60 years, to let that loss be only loss. Who had taken the $50,000 that came from his death and had asked, every single year for 60 years, what the best thing to do with it was. Who had reinvested every dividend, held through every market drop, never panicked, never sold out of fear, never let the short-term noise of the world distract her from the long-term logic of what she was doing. Who had done all of this without telling a single person because she had understood, with the particular clarity of someone who watched people very carefully, that telling people about money was an invitation to something she wanted no part of. Who had found, in the end, someone she trusted to give it to. The jewelry appraiser in Knoxville was a woman named Dr. Constance Webb, who operated out of a second-floor office above a bookstore on Market Street, and whose credentials, printed on a plaque beside the door, included certifications from 3 gemological institutions that meant nothing specific to Nora, but conveyed, in their aggregate, someone who knew what she was looking at. She had been recommended by Loretta Price at the bank, who had used her twice before for estate appraisals and described her as meticulous and not given to flattery in either direction. Dr. Webb looked at what Nora laid on her velvet-covered table with the still, focused expression of someone who had learned, over a long career, not to react to what was in front of them until they had examined it properly. She brought out her loupe. She brought out a small light on a flexible arm. She worked in silence that was professional rather than cold, moving from piece to piece with a systematic thoroughness that Nora found calming, the thoroughness of someone who understood that precision mattered and was not going to be hurried. She spent 40 minutes on the diamonds alone. She examined the sapphire ring for nearly as long, holding it under the loop at angles that seemed to multiply, as if she were reading the stone from several directions simultaneously. She placed it down, made a note, picked it up again. She moved through the emerald necklace, the brooch, the pearl strands, the bracelets, the earrings. She wrote notes as she went in a small bound journal, the kind that suggested she did this every day, and had done it every day for many years. Then she sat back and took off her magnification headset and looked at Nora across the table with an expression that was carefully calibrated to convey information without theater. "Where did these come from?" she asked. "A trunk," Nora said. "My great-aunt's trunk. The coat's lining." Dr. Webb nodded slowly. "She died recently?" Nora confirmed that she had. Dr. Webb nodded again, as though this was consistent with a theory she had been developing. "These are not costume jewelry," she said. "I want to be very clear about that because I imagine you may have entertained the possibility. The diamonds are natural, not synthetic. The largest stone in the ring there is approximately 3.4 carats, F color, VS 1 clarity, old European cut. The cut dates it to the 1930s or 40s. It is a piece of extraordinary quality." She picked up the sapphire ring. "This is a Kashmir sapphire, probably 5 carats. Kashmir sapphires are among the rarest gemstones in the world. The original mines are largely depleted. The color is characteristic, the cornflower blue with that slight velvety milkiness. A stone like this in a contemporary auction would bring, she named a figure." Nora sat very still. Dr. Webb continued across the pieces. The emerald necklace, the brooch, the pearl strands, which were natural rather than cultured, which made a difference that was not trivially small. Each item, each assessment, each number, delivered in the same steady way, the way a geologist reads a landscape, factually without emphasis, because the facts were sufficient. When she finished, she turned to a clean page of her journal and wrote a total at the bottom. She turned the journal to face Nora. The total for the jewelry and coins, itemized, combined, was $381,000. "That is a preliminary figure," Dr. Webb said. "For full appraisal purposes, I would need another examination session and photographs for documentation. But the ballpark is accurate, within approximately 10 to 15%, and I would expect the final figure to be at the higher end of that range rather than the lower." She looked at Nora steadily. "Your great-aunt had extraordinary taste," she said, "and she kept these pieces exceptionally well. The lining of the coat was smart. Silk is an excellent preservation medium. She knew what she had." "Yes," Nora said, "she did." On the drive back from Knoxville, with Clara asleep again in the back seat and the February hills rolling past in the gray afternoon light, Nora did the arithmetic that she had been doing in pieces and fragments since the night before, assembling it now into a single number, understanding it as a whole. The custodial account, $2,341,000 continuing to earn. The jewelry and coins, $380,000, approximately. The original stock certificates, largely redundant since the account was custodial, but potentially retaining some legal and historical value, perhaps more. She didn't know the precise total. She would need accountants, financial advisors, lawyers who specialized in things she had never had cause to think about before. There were going to be taxes. There were going to be transfer fees and legal processes that took weeks. There was going to be a period of time, real and significant, before any of this was hers in the way that a checking account balance is yours. in the way that you can spend it. But the number she was driving through the Tennessee hills with, the number she was carrying in her mind, like something breakable that she was being very careful with, was, in its essential shape, somewhere above $2.5 million. She thought about $11.62. She thought about how those two numbers inhabited the same universe, the same life, the same day, separated by less than 24 hours and a steamer trunk appraised at $30. She thought about Edna May sitting in her kitchen, writing entries in a leather ledger in 1956, in 1962, in 1974, in 1989, in 2003, writing them with the same precise hand, in the same private way, in a house that most people in Harlan's Creek thought of as the home of a mildly eccentric old woman who kept a remarkable garden. She thought about Derek's face at the estate reading, about Linda doing the quiet arithmetic of the china cabinet, about Patricia's voice saying $30. She did not feel the thing she might have expected to feel about those memories. She was surprised to discover that what she felt, in fact, was something close to tenderness. Not for Derek or Patricia specifically, but for the quality of short-sightedness that their behavior had demonstrated, the particular human limitation of being unable to see value in things that didn't present themselves as obviously valuable. She thought about Clara in the back seat, who had not been surprised by the jewelry or the ledger or the number in the bank statement in the way that an adult would have been surprised, who had absorbed each revelation with the gravity of someone for whom extraordinary things had not yet become statistically improbable, who had looked at the photograph of Robert Hargrove standing in a garden in 1950 and said simply, "That's really sad, and also kind of amazing." Yes, Nora thought, it is both of those things. She drove, and the hills moved around her, and she thought about what came next. The phone rang when she was 20 minutes outside of Harlan's Creek, the Bluetooth pickup crackling through the car speakers, Derek's name on the screen. She let it ring 4 times. Then she answered. "Hey," he said. His voice had the particular texture of someone who was being casual about something he was not casual about. "Listen, Renee mentioned she might have heard something from the bank, something about the estate. I just wanted to check in, make sure everything was going smoothly for you." "Everything's fine," she said. A pause, because she said it wrong. Too flat, too neutral, too controlled. Not the voice of a woman managing a difficult situation, but the voice of a woman who was not managing anything, who had moved past management into something else. He heard it or felt it, some change in frequency, and the pause lasted a beat longer than it should have. "You staying in town?" he asked. "In the house?" "For a few more days." Another pause. "Right. Well, if you need anything, let me know." "I will," she said. She would not. She ended the call and drove the last 20 minutes in silence, thinking about Renee at the bank, thinking about the small towns that small towns are, where information moved through the informal architecture of familiarity at the speed of a whispered word. Someone at the bank had mentioned something to someone who knew Renee, or someone who knew Derek, and the information, whatever shape it had taken, had been enough to prompt a phone call. She thought about Edna May's letter. "Don't tell the family until you are ready." She was not yet ready, but she was getting closer. The next 2 days in Harlan's Creek passed in a kind of suspended clarity, the particular quality of time that settles over a person when the world has shifted so fundamentally that ordinary activities take on a strange new texture, She had eggs on toast at Edna May's kitchen table in the morning. She walked Clara to the end of the street and back in the cold air after lunch, and they looked at the garden beds, brown and stripped by February, and talked about what Edna May might have planted there, and what they might plant there too, if they had a garden of their own. She sorted through more of the trunk, going slowly now, with the attention of someone who understood that every layer had been arranged deliberately, that nothing had been put here without thought. In the trunk's interior tray, which lifted out to reveal the larger space below, she found a collection of seed packets wrapped in a cloth bundle. They were old, the paper soft and slightly translucent with age, but each one was sealed in a small plastic sleeve, preserved, viable perhaps. Some varieties that she did not recognize from anything she had seen in any garden store. They were labeled in Edna May's handwriting. The names were not the commercial names you would see on store-bought packets, but older names, heirloom names. The names of varieties that had been passed down rather than commercially produced, that had survived by being passed from person to person across generations. At the bottom of the seed bundle was a note, brief, on the same lined paper. "These were my mother's," it said. "Plant them. Find out what they are." Nora added the seeds to the things she was keeping. She found, at the very bottom of the trunk beneath the clothing and the newspapers and the tissue paper, one more item she had not previously reached. A hardback book, its cover worn to a soft gray, its title still legible. It was a book on investing, published in 1953, its author a man she didn't recognize. The pages inside were heavily annotated in pencil, in a hand she recognized as older than Edna May's own handwriting, a hand that must have belonged to the original owner, and then in Edna May's hand, in the margins of the margins, her annotations responding to the earlier ones, a conversation between two readers conducted across the medium of a book. The first pencil note on the first page, in the older hand, "Harold says the key is patience." The margin note beside it in Edna May's hand, added much later, judging by the ink. Harold was right. As usual, she sat with that book for a long time. On the second afternoon, she called her mother. This was not a call she had been planning. Her mother, Ruth, lived in Memphis with her second husband and occupied a complicated place in Nora's emotional geography, one of those relationships that had been shaped by years of small failures on both sides and the particular weight of things that had not been said for so long that saying them now required an effort disproportionate to their content. Ruth had not been at the estate reading, had not kept in touch with the Calloway side since the divorce from Nora's father. But she was Nora's mother, and this was the kind of thing Nora had realized sitting at Edna May's kitchen table. Not that you should probably tell your mother about. She called and got voicemail and left a message that said she was in Harlan's Creek and that something had happened and that she would call again soon. Ruth called back in 20 minutes, which was faster than Nora had expected. "I heard from Patricia," Ruth said without preamble. "She said you got a trunk." "I did." A pause. And it had some things in it. Ruth was quiet for a moment. This quiet was different from her ordinary quiet, which was the quiet of someone holding back an opinion. This quiet was a listening quiet. "What kind of things?" she asked. Nora told her. Not all of it, but enough. The ledger, the jewelry, the bank account, the number. The silence on Ruth's end went very long. "Lord," she finally said, in a voice Nora had never heard her use before, a voice stripped of its ordinary surface texture, reduced to something simple and real. "I know," Nora said. "She was going to leave that to you." "She did," Nora said. "I was the only one who visited." Ruth made a sound that was not quite a word. Then, "That woman." She said it the way you say something about a person who has surprised you, in a way you feel you should have anticipated and didn't. They talked for an hour. It was the longest conversation Nora had had with her mother in 3 years. It was not, precisely, a resolution of the complicated geography between them. Those things do not resolve in an hour. But it was a real conversation, the kind in which two people are actually present with each other rather than performing presence, and that was more than they had managed in a long time. Near the end of it, Ruth said something that stayed with Nora for the days that followed. "You're going to need to be careful," she said. "With the family, people change when there's money involved. People who have always been a certain way with you start being a different way. You need to decide who to tell, and when, and how, before they decide it for you." "I know," Nora said. "And you need to take care of yourself first. Before anyone else, you and Clara. That's what Edna May would have wanted. That's why she left it to you, and not to Derek." Nora was quiet. She was thinking about the conversation she hadn't had yet, the one she was going to have with the family eventually. The conversation in which $30 became a different number, in which an old trunk became something else entirely, in which the story of the estate reading reconstituted itself around an axis that nobody at that table had seen. She was thinking about being ready for that. She wasn't ready yet, but she was going to be. That evening, she sat at Edna May's kitchen table with the ledger and the contents of the trunk spread around her, and a pad of paper on which she had been writing things down. The way she always worked through things that were too large to hold in her head, breaking them into parts, ordering the parts, understanding the sequence of what needed to happen. She had found, in the 2 days since the estate reading, that the shock of the number had given way to something different, something that felt more like clarity than disbelief. The disbelief had been there, fully and genuinely, in those first hours. She had sat in this kitchen and looked at a number, and felt the way you feel when the floor of what is possible shifts beneath you, when the walls of the room you have been living in turn out to have been inside a larger room the whole time. But she had always been, at her essential nature, a practical person, had always been someone who, given a fact, moved toward the question of what to do with it. Grief or joy or shock, these were real, but they existed alongside the practical mind, not instead of it. And the practical mind, in the 2 days since the estate reading, had been doing what practical minds do. She had a list. Financial advisor, attorney. Not Beaumont, who was an estate lawyer and a good one, but a different kind of attorney. Someone who handled wealth management and taxes and the specific legal machinery that you needed when money stopped being a daily problem and became a different kind of question. She had called the Bar Association in Knoxville and asked for referrals, and had written down 3 names with phone numbers beside them. She had a second list. Clara's school. Not the motel parking lot school, not the arrangement they had been managing since October, but a real school. A consistent one. In a place with a home, not a room that smelled of industrial cleaner and the particular sadness of transients. She had a third list, shorter, with 2 things on it. The first was a question she had written down and underlined. What did Edna May want this to become? The second was a sentence that was not a question. It was the sentence that had been forming in her mind since the night she had first sat in this kitchen with the jewelry spread on the table and the ledger open in front of her, since she had read the letter and understood what it contained and why it had been written the way it had. The sentence was this: "She chose me because I came." She sat with that for a while, the simplicity of it. You come to someone, you ask them questions, you write letters on actual paper, in actual envelopes. You treat them as though their interior world is interesting. You do this because you mean it, because you are genuinely curious, not because you have calculated that being kind to an old woman might produce a return at some future date. And 60 years of patient accumulation, built around a grief that never fully healed, but was metabolized into something else, finds its way to you. She thought about the cost of that, the cost to Edna May of doing this without telling anyone, of carrying a number that large in a house that small for 6 decades, of watching the family gathers at Christmas and Thanksgiving and weddings and funerals, and knowing what she knew and saying nothing, of enduring the particular condescension that gets directed at elderly women who live alone in small houses, the gentle dismissiveness of people who assume that simple means poor and quiet means empty. The cost of it was enormous. The patience required was the kind that most people don't have, for the patience of someone who has learned the hard way that the world cannot be rushed, and that the only dignified response to that is to work within it on your own terms and at your own speed, and to trust that the right things, given time and proper conditions, will grow. She thought about the garden. She thought about seeds in a cloth bundle at the bottom of an old trunk. Find out what they are. Clara had come downstairs in her pajamas and was standing in the kitchen doorway with her stuffed rabbit under one arm, looking at her mother with those dark, evaluating eyes. "You're making lists again," she said. "I'm figuring things out," Nora said. Clara came and sat at the table and picked up the packet of seeds nearest to her and turned it over in her hands, reading the handwritten name on the label. "What does this say?" she asked. The handwriting was Edna May's, and the name was an old heirloom variety that Clara wouldn't have seen on any seed packet in any store. Nora leaned over and read it. "That's a kind of tomato," she said. "An old kind, from before they started breeding them for shelf life instead of taste." "Can we grow it?" "I think so." "Where?" Nora looked at her daughter, at the seed packet in the child's hand, at the dark Tennessee night outside the kitchen window. She thought about the house on Sycamore Lane that was going to be sold, that had been assessed at $92,000 and was going to become proceeds in an estate account split among the named beneficiaries, minus her, who had received the trunk. She thought about what it would take to buy a house instead of a motel room, about what a down payment would look like now, compared to what it had looked like yesterday. She thought about a garden. "I don't know yet," she said, "but somewhere with sun." Clara nodded with the gravity of someone filing this information away for future reference. She turned the seed packet over in her hands one more time, and then she set it down carefully, the way you put down something you want to come back to, and she went back upstairs to bed. Nora sat alone at the kitchen table for a long time after, with the seed packets and the ledger and the lists, and the photograph of Robert Hargrove in its envelope, and the brass key on its red ribbon, and the index card with the access code, all of it spread before her in the pool of the kitchen light. She thought about what it meant to be trusted, about what it meant to have someone choose you. Out of all the people available to be chosen, Not because you were the most successful or the most impressive or the most clearly positioned to benefit from a gift, but because you came, because you were curious, because you treated someone as though their life had weight. She thought about Derek's truck in the parking lot, about Patricia's $30, about Renee already on her way back to Charlotte with the pearl necklace in her handbag. She thought about Clara upstairs in the bed, asleep, with no knowledge yet of what their life was going to look like different from this, of the particular kind of relief that was coming, the kind that is not a single moment of joy, but the gradual lifting of something that has been pressing down on you for so long you have stopped noticing the pressure and only know it is gone when it goes. That was still ahead of them. The lifting was still ahead. But she could feel it now, at the edges, the way you feel a change in weather before it arrives, in the quality of the light, in the way the air holds itself differently. She gathered the seed packets into their cloth bundle and tied it the way she had found it. And she put the ledger in the bag she had brought with her. And she folded the lists and put them in her blazer pocket beside Edna May's letter. She turned off the kitchen light. She stood for a moment in the dark kitchen of a house that had held a woman's secret for 60 years, listening to the sound of the old house breathing around her. And she thought about $30, about what $30 could mean to a person who looked at an old trunk and saw nothing but an old trunk, and what it could mean to a person who looked at the same object and understood that the question of value was always, in the end, a question of whether you were willing to look. She had looked, and what she had found was going to change everything. Tomorrow, she would call the financial advisor. She would call the second attorney. She would begin the process of understanding precisely what she had, in legal and financial terms, and what the path forward looked like, and how long it would take to move the custodial account into her own name and begin to act on what it contained. Tomorrow, the practical machinery would start, and with it, the long, careful process of building something new from this foundation that a dead woman had spent 60 years laying. But tonight, she stood in the dark kitchen and let herself know what she knew. Without qualification, without the usual necessary suppression of hope that she had practiced for so long, it had become reflex. She knew what she had. She knew who she was. She was the woman Edna May had chosen. The woman who had come, who had written letters, who had been curious about an old woman's interior world because she was genuinely interested, not because she wanted anything. She was the woman who had been sitting at a table full of relatives when the lawyer said $30 and had kept her voice level and said that's fine. She was Nora Calloway, and she was going to be fine in a way that was going to require a different word than fine entirely. She went upstairs to where her daughter was sleeping. She stood in the doorway for a moment, the way you do, watching. Then she went to sleep, and for the first time in 7 months, she did not lie awake calculating anything. There was nothing left to calculate. The number was already there. The work of building was still ahead, but the ground beneath it was solid now, solid and deep, and laid by hands that had understood, better than anyone around her had ever guessed, exactly what they were doing, and why, and for whom. Sleep came easily. Outside, the Tennessee stars were very bright, and the garden was dormant, and the seeds in the cloth bundle were waiting to find out what they would become. The financial advisor's name was James Whitfield, and he worked out of a 4th-floor office in Knoxville with a view of the river and the kind of quiet competence that had been earned rather than performed. He had been recommended by the second attorney, see a woman named Diane Cho, who specialized in wealth management and estate law, and who had shaken Nora's hand at the beginning of their first meeting, and said, with the directness Nora had immediately liked, "I'm going to assume you're smarter than people have been treating you, and we'll go from there." Nora had liked that very much. She drove to Knoxville for the first meeting on a Thursday morning in late February, 10 days after the estate reading, with the ledger and the folder of documents from the safe deposit box, and a list of questions she had written out at Edna May's kitchen table in the nights between. Clara was in school, the first full week of consistent attendance she had managed since October, enrolled in Harlan's Creek Elementary through a temporary arrangement while the longer-term plan took shape. The school was a small brick building 3 blocks from the house on Sycamore Lane, and the teacher, a woman named Mrs. Garland, who had taught 3rd through 5th grade for 22 years and had the easy authority of someone who had seen everything and was not alarmed by any of it, had welcomed Clara on her first day with a matter-of-fact warmth that made the child stand up slightly straighter. "She's settling in well," Mrs. Garland had said to Nora at pickup on the second day. "She's a reader, the quiet, fierce kind. You'll need to keep her supplied." Nora had held on to that on the drive to Knoxville, the quiet, fierce kind. Yes. James Whitfield looked at the documents she had brought with the same focus at stillness that Dr. Webb had brought to the jewelry, and the particular concentration of someone for whom the object on the table is not a surprise, so much as a question to be answered correctly. He asked precise questions. He made notes in a clean hand on a yellow legal pad. He was not a man who performed reactions. He processed them internally and delivered conclusions. After an hour, he sat back and looked at her across the desk. "The custodial account is currently structured as primarily equity holdings," he said. "Long position stocks, very low turnover, accumulated dividends reinvested. The composition is heavily weighted toward companies that have been compounding for 50 to 60 years, which means the cost basis is almost irrelevant to the current value. We're going to have to be thoughtful about any liquidation because the capital gains implications are significant." He said a number, and the tax figure, the portion that would go to the government on the first dollar she moved. She had expected this. She had read enough in the 10 days since the estate reading to understand, at a basic level, that inherited wealth and taxes were not separable, that the government's claim on the money was real and had to be factored into everything. "What's the strategy?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who has been asked the right question. "Patience," he said, "which is, I imagine, not a surprise given who built this." She smiled for the first time in the meeting. They talked for another 2 hours. By the end of it, she had a framework. Not a plan in every detail, but the shape of one, the essential logic of how the money moved from where it was to where she could use it, while minimizing what the government took and protecting what remained. There would be a diversification of the portfolio, gradual, strategic. There would be a cash position established for near-term needs. There would be a trust structure for Clara's future, separate from the operating accounts. There would be, Whitfield said at the end, as he gathered his notes, a significant life change. "I want to make sure you understand that this takes time to feel real. In my experience, people in your situation, coming from genuine financial difficulty, sometimes have trouble acting on the resources they have because the habit of scarcity is deeply ingrained. I want you to know that the money is real. The transfer will complete. And within 6 weeks, you will have access to a cash position sufficient to address your immediate needs and begin building. She thanked him and went back to Harlan's Creek. She stopped at the hardware store on the way through town and bought a packet of seed-starting trays and a bag of potting mix and a small grow light, the kind used for starting seeds indoors in late winter. She carried them into Edna May's kitchen and set them on the counter, and that evening, after Clara was in bed, she opened the cloth bundle of heirloom seeds and began to read the labels. There were varieties she had never heard of, names that carried the taste of another era. An heirloom tomato called Mortgage Lifter, which made her stop and read the name twice, and then hold the packet in her hands for a moment. I'm feeling the specific texture of a coincidence that was too well fitted to be entirely accidental, though she knew it was. A cucumber variety from the early part of the 20th century. A bean with a name she couldn't pronounce that the label said had originated in the mountains of this same part of Tennessee, passed from kitchen garden to kitchen garden for generations. She began filling the seed trays. She worked slowly, pressing seeds into the dark soil with the care of someone learning a new language from a book that had been left for them. She was not a gardener. She had never had a garden. Gardens required land, and land required roots, and roots required the kind of stability that had been unavailable to her for most of her adult life. But she was learning that the skills required for certain things were more available than she had realized, that patience and attention and the willingness to begin without knowing exactly how it would turn out were more portable than she had given herself credit for. The grow light hummed on the counter. Outside, February was still pressy against the windows. She thought about Mortgage Lifter, which was, it turned out, a real variety with a real history, developed in the 1930s by a man in West Virginia who sold the tomatoes to his neighbors for $1 each and used the money to pay off the mortgage on his farm. The name was not metaphorical, it was biographical. She laughed a little, alone in the kitchen at 10 at night. She planted all of the seeds. Derek called again on a Friday, 2 weeks after the estate reading. From this time, his voice carried less of the studied casualness and more of something harder. The voice of a man who has received partial information from multiple sources and is frustrated by the incompleteness of it. Renee had heard something at the bank. Jimmy's wife had run into Loretta Price at the grocery store and come away with impressions she couldn't fully articulate. Patricia had been calling various people and assembling a mosaic from the pieces she gathered, and the mosaic was suggesting something that none of them had anticipated. "What exactly did she leave you?" Derek asked. "Because I'm hearing things." Nora was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and Clara's school schedule in front of her, and the particular calmness of a woman who has had 2 weeks to understand where she stands. "The trunk," she said, aught like the lawyer said. Nora. Her name in that tone, the tone of someone invoking a relationship as a claim. She recognized it, had recognized it all her life, the specific way Derek said her name when he wanted something and was framing the wanting as concern. "I need you to be straight with me. Was there something in the trunk? Something significant?" She thought about Edna May's letter. "Don't tell the family until you are ready." She thought about Diane Cho shaking her hand and saying, "I'm going to assume you're smarter than people have been treating you." She was ready. "Yes," she said, There was. The silence on his end went very long. She told him, not the precise numbers, but the shape of it. The ledger. The custodial account. The 60 years of investing she had known nothing about. The jewelry in the coat's lining. The safe deposit box. And she said it without performance, without the satisfaction she might have permitted herself in another mood, with a flatness that was not cruelty, but was not accommodation either. She said it as fact, the way Edna May had always delivered difficult truths, precisely and without decoration. The silence that followed was the longest he had maintained in any conversation she could remember. She left all of that to you, he said, finally. Specifically to you. Specifically to me, she confirmed. In the form of a trunk, appraised at $30. He didn't say anything. She listened to the quality of that silence and thought about the china cabinet, about Linda's quiet arithmetic, about $30 said with Patricia's particular inflection. And she waited. That's, he started and stopped. She let him stop. When he spoke again, I know his voice had changed. The performance had dropped out of it. What was underneath was something more complicated than she had expected. Not exactly the naked envy she had been braced for, but something with more texture. Something that might have been, underneath the resentment she could still hear, a grudging and entirely unwilling recognition. She always did things her own way, he said, about Edna May. Yes, Nora said. She did. He made a sound that was not an apology, and not a concession, but occupied some space adjacent to both. She waited to see if there would be more, and when there wasn't, she said she had to go and ended the call. She sat at the table for a moment. Then she picked up her coffee and drank it, and it was still warm. Patricia called that evening. This was a longer call, and a more complicated one, because Patricia was not simply greedy, was not reducible to that single note. She was a woman who had spent her life organizing the world according to a hierarchy she had inherited from her own parents and refined over decades, in which certain people occupied certain positions, and the positions were largely fixed, and the fixedness of them was, she seemed to feel, a form of justice. Nora had always occupied a specific position in that hierarchy, one shaped by a combination of Patricia's sense that Nora had never applied herself properly, had made choices that reflected poorly on the family, had been, from a certain angle, a disappointment. The money had disorganized the hierarchy, and Patricia was calling to reorganize it. She began with sympathy, said that she hoped Nora understood the responsibility that came with a thing like this, that she hoped Nora had good people around her, that she hoped she was making thoughtful decisions. Each statement was calibrated to sound like concern and function as instruction. Nora listened through the first several minutes of it, with the attention of someone reading between lines. Then Patricia said, in the specific register of someone delivering something they have been building toward, that of course family looks out for family, that of course if Nora needed guidance from people with more experience managing these kinds of situations, the family would be there. Nora understood what was being said. "Thank you," she said. "I have a financial advisor and an attorney." A pause. "Good," Patricia said, in a tone that wasn't pleased, but was covering not pleased with a thin layer of approval. "I've been thinking," Nora said, and she kept her voice even and unhurried, about what Edna May wanted for this money. She was very specific in her letter. She wanted it to do what it had already been doing, to accumulate, to be put to work, not to be distributed among people who hadn't been part of building it. Silence, She left it to me, Nora continued. She left it to me for specific reasons that she took the trouble to explain. I'm going to honor those reasons. There was a longer silence. Nobody in this family knew she had that kind of money, Patricia said finally, and her voice had lost the calibrated tone and was just the voice of a woman trying to make sense of something that had upended her understanding of the world. She didn't want them to, Nora said. Well, Patricia said, and her voice had a quality Nora had never heard in it before, something stripped of its usual certainty, something that was almost, though not quite, respect. Well, Nora told her good night. She stood in the kitchen for a while after, with the phone in her hand, and she thought about the long patience it had taken to occupy her position in that family's hierarchy, without becoming what the hierarchy wanted her to be. The patience of not letting other people's assessment of you become your own. She thought about Edna May doing the same thing for 60 years. She thought about seeds. The legal transfer of the custodial account was completed on a Wednesday morning, 38 days after the estate reading. Diane Cho called her at 9:15 to say that the transfer was final, that the account was now in Nora's name, and that the cash position James Whitfield had established was available. She said the figures in a professional, even tone, as she had in every conversation they had had, as though the numbers were simply numbers, information to be processed. Nora was sitting at Edna May's kitchen table when the call came. Clara was at school. The seed trays on the counter had small green shoots in them now, the first emergence of the heirloom seeds, frail and insistent, as all new things are frail and insistent, pushing upward through the dark soil toward the grow light, with a certainty that had nothing to do with any knowledge of what awaited them, but was simply the thing that seeds do. She thanked Diane and sat with the phone in her hands for a moment. Then she went to look at the seedlings. They were small, still, most of them no taller than an inch, but they were there. That was the thing. They were there. She thought about Edna May in this kitchen in 1956, writing the first entry in the ledger. 50 shares, $2.20 commission paid to H. Fitch. Not looking at what she had and finding it small. Looking at what she had and understanding it as a beginning. She called James Whitfield and confirmed the instructions they had discussed. She called the real estate agent she had contacted 2 weeks earlier, a woman named Pam, who worked the residential market in the area around Harlan's Creek, and had, when Nora had first called to explain her situation, said, "How many bedrooms?" with the practical warmth of someone who understood that what mattered was what came next. 3, Nora had said. And land, even a little bit of land. "I think I know just the thing," Pam had said. The house was 8 miles outside of Harlan's Creek, on a road that went up into the hills in the unhurried way of roads that have been there a long time. It was not a large house, not by the standards of what the money could have purchased, not if she had wanted to demonstrate that the world had changed. But it was a real house, solidly built in the 1960s, a farmhouse style with a covered porch and 4 proper rooms upstairs and 2 down, and a kitchen with a window that looked east and would get the morning light. There was a barn that needed work. There were 2 acres of land, and on one of them, running along the south-facing slope, were beds that had been tended and then let go, visible beneath the March grass as an infrastructure of good soil and intelligent planning. Someone had gardened here seriously once. Now she stood in the south-facing field on the afternoon Pam took her through the property and looked at the beds and thought about what they could hold. Clara, standing beside her, said, "We could put the tomatoes here." Nora looked at her daughter. She thought about mortgage lifter and what it was named for and why. "Yes," she said. "We could." She made the offer the next morning. The closing took 3 weeks, and in those 3 weeks, she and Clara continued to live in Edna May's house, which felt right in the way that transitional spaces sometimes feel right, when the transition is genuinely temporary, and you can feel the shape of what comes next already forming. She finished sorting through the trunk. She cataloged everything with the careful specificity that felt, she realized, like its own form of honoring what Edna May had done. The same respect for documentation, the same understanding that records are a form of presence. She found, at the very base of the trunk, one more thing she had missed in the earlier explorations, hidden in a small pocket sewn into the interior wall at the back. It was a folded piece of paper, older than any of the other documents, its creases soft with decades of being in one position. She unfolded it carefully. It was a letter, written in the looping script she had come to associate with Robert Hargrove's era, the same hand that had written on the back of the photograph. It was dated August 1951, 4 months before he died, written from Korea. She read it slowly. It was a letter that a 23-year-old man had written to the woman he was going to marry, one from a place where the mail was unreliable, and the days were cold and long, and the future was something you tried to hold on to, but couldn't always reach. It was not a remarkable letter, not in the literary sense. It was not eloquent beyond the eloquence of genuine feeling delivered without artifice. But it was real in the way that certain things are real, with the weight of a person's actual presence in every line. The weight of someone who had been alive and had thoughts, and had loved someone, and had wanted, more than anything, to come home. He talked about the mountains, about how they reminded him, despite everything, of these mountains. About how he kept thinking of a specific morning in summer when he and Edna May had stood in her mother's garden early, before the heat of the day, and watched the light come over the ridge. About how he thought about that morning as a way of keeping himself located, of staying connected to the thing he was coming back for. He said, "When I get home, we are going to plant the biggest garden anyone in this county has ever seen. I've been making plans for it in my head because it gives me something specific to think toward." He didn't come home. Nora sat with the letter for a long time. She thought about Edna May reading this letter for the first time in 1951 or 1952, before or after the Army's notification arrived. She thought about what you did with love that had nowhere to go, with plans that would never be carried out, with the morning in the garden that nobody else would ever see from the same angle again. You built something. That was what you did. You took the thing that remained, and you built something with it. No, and you kept building for 60 years, and you waited for the right person to find it. She folded the letter back into its careful creases and placed it with the photograph in its envelope. She was going to frame them both. The day she got the keys to the farmhouse was the last day of March, which felt like a date Edna May might have chosen if she had been the type to choreograph things, which she had been, in her own precise way. The end of the month, the beginning of the growing season. Clara ran ahead of her up the porch steps and pushed through the door with the total confidence of someone who had already fully understood that this was home. Nora followed more slowly, stopping at the door, her hand on the frame, looking at the interior, at the morning light coming through the east-facing kitchen window, At the empty rooms that smelled of old wood and clean, cold air, and the particular silence of a house that is waiting. She thought about the motel room, about $11.62, about a credit card $600 over its limit, and a tank of gas put on account, and crackers found behind the passenger seat. She stood in the doorway and let the distance between that morning and this one be fully real. Did not compress it or minimize it or look past it to the future. Let it be the full distance it was. It was a very long way. She walked in. Clara had already found the room she wanted, the one with the window that looked toward the south field, because she had identified, with the practical intelligence of a child who was inheriting her mother's orientation toward the directional, that the south field was where the garden was going to be. She was standing in the middle of the empty room with her arms out, measuring it in the way children measure spaces, not with numbers, but with the felt sense of how much room there was. "Is this enough?" Nora asked from the doorway. "It's perfect," Clara said with complete certainty. Nora thought about all the rooms that had been not perfect. The motel room, the apartment before the motel room, the smaller apartment before that. The series of compromises they had inhabited, each one accepted because there was nothing better available, each one made as livable as possible by the specific effort of a woman who had refused, even in the worst of it, to let her daughter stop believing in the possibility of better. Perfect, she agreed. They spent the first night in sleeping bags on the floor of the living room because the furniture hadn't arrived yet, and Clara thought this was the best possible way to inaugurate a house, and Nora didn't disagree with her, and they ate sandwiches and looked up at the ceiling of the room that was theirs, fully and legally and permanently theirs. No lease, no landlord, no letter that could arrive on a Tuesday and change everything. Clara said, "Mom, yes. Are we going to be okay now?" Nora looked at the ceiling. "Yes," she said. "We are. Not fine. Not just okay. But okay was the right word for right now, for this first night, for the sleeping bags on the floor, and the sandwiches in the morning light that would come through the east window of the kitchen in about 8 hours. Okay was the word for the beginning of a thing. Oh, and this was a beginning. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want to write Edna May a letter." Nora looked at her. "She can't receive it," she said. "I know." Clara's voice was matter-of-fact, in the way that children are matter-of-fact about things adults tend to sentimentalize. "But I want to tell her what we think of the house." "Okay," Nora said, "and thank her." "Okay." Clara turned onto her side in the sleeping bag and closed her eyes. "You should write one too," she said. Nora lay on her back and looked at the ceiling of the house for a long time. "Yes," she said. "I should." The garden that spring was not planned on a grand scale. She understood, from the journals and the ledger and the letter about the biggest garden anyone in the county had ever seen, that gardens were not made in one season. They were made by showing up, year after year, adding to what was already there, correcting what hadn't worked, building towards something you could only see partly in advance. She hired a man named Earl from town, who had worked gardens all his life, and who came and looked at the south-facing beds with the eyes of someone reading something that had been written before, and said that whoever had been here before her had done good work, that the soil was in a proper state, that it wanted planting. She put the heirloom seeds in. The mortgage lifter went in the long bed along the south wall of the barn. The cucumbers went in beside them. The bean with the unpronounceable name went in at the back, where it could climb the old trellis that Earl had repaired over 2 days with the focused attention of a craftsman who understood that a trellis was not decorative, but structural. Clara planted her own row, a child's row, seeds pressed in with small hands and watered with a small watering can that Nora had bought her at Morrison's Feed and Supply on the main street of Harlan's Creek, where the man behind the counter knew everyone who came through the door and had known Edna Mae Hargrove for 30 years, and said so when Nora mentioned who had owned the property she had inherited. She was a remarkable woman, he said. Yes, Nora agreed. Remarkable was not quite the word, but it was the word available to people who had known Edna May from the outside. It was the word for what you could see of her, the garden and the quiet, and the refusal to be what people expected. The word for the interior, for the ledger and the custodial account, and the coat's hidden lining. The word for all of that was something closer to extraordinary, in the precise original sense of the word, beyond what is ordinary, past what is expected, in a territory that the ordinary maps do not reach. She was putting a trellis up for the beans when she heard a car come up the drive and looked around to find Patricia getting out of her silver sedan. Nora set down the garden gloves. Patricia had not called ahead. This was either deliberate or characteristic, probably both. She stood in the drive looking at the house, and then at the garden, and then at Nora, and her expression was not what Nora had expected. She had expected the expression she knew, the cataloging look, the quiet assessment. Instead, Patricia looked like a woman who had driven somewhere because she needed to, and had not quite worked out what she was going to say when she arrived. She was carrying a casserole dish. The gesture was so specifically, precisely Patricia, so absolutely in character. So much the language of a woman who expressed things through the management of food and its provision, that Nora felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't known was tightened. Patricia walked toward her and held out the dish and said, a little formally, "I made this for you. For the new house." Nora took it. They stood in the garden for a moment. "It looks well," Patricia said, looking at the beds. Her voice was careful, as though she was choosing her words from a set of options and taking her time with the choosing. "We just started," Nora said. Patricia's eyes moved to the trellis, to the small green shoots in the mortgage lifter bed, to the barn in the background, to the farmhouse with the covered porch. She was taking it in the way she took in everything, piece by piece, assembling it into an overall assessment. "She's really gone," Patricia said. "Finally." She meant Edna May. "Yes," Nora said. "She was a hard woman to know," Patricia said, and there was something in her voice that was trying to say something more than the words were saying, something that was working its way toward an admission the words weren't quite big enough for. "She knew how to keep things to herself," Nora said. Patricia looked at her. There was a long pause, the kind that has weight in it, the kind that fills up with things neither person is saying aloud but both people can hear. "I wasn't kind to you," Patricia said. "At the reading." Nora waited. "I said $30 like it was." Patricia paused, pressing her lips together. "I wasn't kind." "No," Nora said. "You weren't." Patricia looked at the garden beds. She had the look of a woman doing something difficult, and doing it anyway. The look of effort applied to a task that required more than the person wanted to give, but which the person had decided, for their own reasons, was required. "She knew you would come," Patricia said, meaning, Edna May, meaning what she had known about Nora, meaning the letters and the visits, and the specific quality of attention that Nora had given to an old woman that nobody else had thought worth giving. She knew you would come because you always did. The rest of us stopped coming. Nora held the casserole dish and didn't say anything. I stopped coming, Patricia said. The garden was very quiet. The early April light was doing what April light in Tennessee does, coming in at an angle that made everything look newly arrived, newly uncovered, as though the world had been there all along and was only now allowing itself to be seen. "Thank you for the casserole," Nora said. Patricia nodded. She turned and walked back to her silver sedan and drove away down the hill. Nora stood in the garden, holding a casserole dish, until Clara came running from the barn, where she had been attempting to make friends with a barn cat of uncertain temperament. Who was that? Your great-aunt Patricia? What did she want? Nora looked at the driveway where the silver sedan had been. To say something that was hard for her to say, she said. Clara absorbed this. Did she say it? More or less. Clara nodded, filing this away in whatever archive she maintained of adult behavior and its frequently indirect communications. Then she said that the barn cat had let her pet it twice and had only run away once, and that she thought this was progress. Yes, Nora said. It is. They went inside for lunch. In the weeks that followed, she began to understand, on a practical and embodied way, what Edna May had meant by the kind of sum that changes what problems are possible. It was not that the problems disappeared. It was that the nature of the problems changed, and the change was, when you encountered it after years of the other kind, almost disorienting in its simplicity. Clara's school was the first thing. Enrolled permanently in the district where the farmhouse stood, in a school small enough that a Garland remained her teacher, and large enough to have a library with actual books, and an art program that Clara had, on her first day of participation, treated as though she had been waiting for it her entire life, which in a certain sense she had. The motel room in the rearview mirror, the Dollar General vest in a box she wasn't sure what to do with, whether to keep it as a reminder of something she didn't want to forget, or dispose of it as something she was glad to be done with. She kept it, folded on the shelf in her closet. Some things you kept. She set up the trust for Clara the way James Whitfield had outlined, the structure that would provide for her education and establish a foundation she could build on and adjust as she grew into the person she was going to become, which was a person Nora was already deeply interested to meet. She paid off the credit cards, all of them. The specific satisfaction of watching those balances go to zero was out of proportion to the amounts, which were, in the context of the custodial account, small. But the disproportionate satisfaction made sense when she understood it, as the release of a pressure so constant she had stopped consciously feeling it. A weight that had been there so long it had become part of her own physical sense of herself. Its absence was the relief of something you had been carrying for so long you had forgotten the feeling of putting it down. She wrote the letter to Edna May. She sat at the kitchen table on a morning in May, with the east light coming through the window, and she wrote it by hand, on paper, in an envelope, the way she had always written to the old woman when she was alive, because it was the only form that felt right for a letter that was going to sit in a box rather than travel anywhere. She tried to say everything she wanted to say, and found, as she always found, when she tried to say everything, that everything was too large to fit in a letter. So she said the essential things instead. She said that the house was good, and the garden was coming in, and that Clara had named the barn cat Loretta after the bank manager, and that Loretta the cat had decided to allow this. She said that she had read Robert's letter, and that she understood, or thought she did, what had been built, and why, and from what material. She said that she would plant the biggest garden anyone in this county has ever seen. Not all at once, because gardens were not made all at once, but year by year, the way everything that lasts is made. She said that she had never felt, in her adult life, that someone had looked at her clearly and found her equal to a task, and that Edna May had done that, had looked at her clearly and trusted what she saw, and that she was going to try every day to be worth that trust. She said thank you in the last line, and then sat for a moment, pen in hand, because thank you seemed insufficient and also exactly right, in the way that the true things often are both insufficient and exactly right at once. She sealed the envelope. She wrote Edna May's name on the front in her own handwriting, not the precise architectural script, but her ordinary hand, the hand she used for grocery lists and school forms and the things of daily life. She put the envelope in the box where she had put Robert's letter and the photograph and the annotated investing book and the ledger, the box that had become, in the months since the estate reading, a kind of archive, the record of a life and what it had made and what it had meant. She put the lid on the box and left it on the shelf where it would stay. Some things you kept. The mortgage lifter tomatoes came in August. They were, even for someone who had not grown a garden before and was therefore without a comparison point, clearly something extraordinary. The fruits were large and deeply colored, the red of them so saturated it looked almost deliberate, almost chosen. And when she cut the first one open on the kitchen counter, with Clara watching beside her, the interior was dense and richly aromatic in the way of things grown in good soil and given adequate time, in the way of things not bred for shelf life, but for flavor, for the experience of eating them. Clara ate a slice and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "This is what a tomato is supposed to taste like." "Yes," Nora said. They made sandwiches with thick slices of the mortgage lifter and good bread and butter, and sat on the porch in the August heat and ate them, and the afternoon was ordinary in the way that the best days often are ordinary, not marked by any significant event, not distinguished by anything except the quality of attention available to it, the capacity, newly restored in both of them, to simply be in a moment without monitoring it for threats. Nora thought about the estate reading, about the table of relatives and the china and the pearls and the cash and the particular sound of Patricia's voice saying $30. She thought about it without bitterness, which surprised her because she had half expected bitterness to arrive eventually and settle in, the way resentments do when they've had sufficient time to take root. It hadn't. She had found, over the months since, that the story of the estate reading was not primarily a story about what had been done to her. It was a story about what had been waiting to be found. The unkindness of the table had been real, but incidental, a footnote to something much larger, the background noise against which the actual story had played out. The actual story was Edna May at this kitchen table in 1956, writing $50 and IBM Corporation in a leather ledger by lamplight, with the letter from Robert in a box somewhere, carrying a grief that she had metabolized into the most sustained and patient act of love Nora had ever encountered. The actual story was 60 years of showing up. 60 years of reinvested dividends and held positions, and the extraordinary, ordinary patience of a woman who had decided, very clearly, what she was building and for whom, and who had never deviated from that decision. The actual story was a trunk appraised at $30 that contained, in its layers and its false pockets, and its carefully preserved cloth, and its coat with its hidden lining, the accumulated evidence of a life organized around a love and a loss, and a profound, precise faith in one specific person she had barely known but had assessed, with the accuracy of someone who had spent a lifetime reading people, as being worth the investment. She thought about what she had done since. The accounts opened, the trust established, the house bought, the garden planted, the seeds from the bundle in the cloth at the bottom of the trunk coming up out of the soil one by one into the Tennessee light, the barn cat, the school, Clara's rose in the garden, the one she planted with her own hands and watered every morning before the bus came and checked every afternoon when she got home, with the devotion of someone who understands that attention is a form of care. She thought about what she still had to do. The portfolio, which James Whitfield was managing with the patience the thing required, would continue to grow, and the quarterly dividends would continue to arrive, and in 5 years, or 10, the number would be different again. Larger, more capable, more available for the things she was beginning to think about. The community garden she was planning in Harlan's Creek on a vacant lot off Main Street, where people could grow their own food in good soil, maintained collectively, maintained by showing up, the way Edna May had maintained everything. The fund she was establishing for women in the county who needed what she had needed, not the dramatic rescue, but the foothold, the rope thrown down to someone drowning, the space to climb. She was not going to make Edna May's choice, the choice of silence, the choice of building in secret for 60 years and speaking only at the end. That had been the right choice for Edna May, the choice consistent with who she was and what she understood about the people around her. It was not the only choice, so Nora's choice was going to be visible about it, to say, here is what someone gave me, and here is what I am doing with it, to make the chain of it visible rather than private, to let what had been built in secret become something that could multiply in the open, the way certain things can only multiply when they are brought into the light. She thought this would have been acceptable to Edna May. She thought the old woman would have approved of the multiplying, if not necessarily of the visibility. She thought Edna May would have had a dry, precise comment about the visibility that Nora would have thought about for days afterward. She missed her. She had not expected to miss someone she had only known from 4 visits and years of letters. But she did. She missed the letters most, the particular quality of them, the thought that had gone into each word, the sense of speaking to someone who was genuinely listening. She was still listening. She was listening now. Clara came in from the garden with dirt on her hands and a tomato in each one, held up like evidence. "Look at these," she said. Nora looked at the tomatoes and then at her daughter. Clara's face was the face of a child who has grown up. Not in the way that children grow up when something terrible has happened, and they have been required to become older than their age, but in the way that children grow up when they have been given, in spite of difficulty, the things they needed, and have therefore grown into something rather than just out of something. There was a quality in her face of genuine ease, not the performed ease of a child managing her circumstances, but the real thing, the ease of someone who has arrived somewhere. "They're enormous," Nora said. "Better than last year," Clara said, with the authority of a gardener assessing the data. She was right. They were better than last year. The soil was improving. That was what soil did when you tended it, when you added to it and gave it what it needed, and let it do what it was built to do. It improved. Year by year, season by season, with the patient accumulation of good things, it became more capable of producing something extraordinary from something ordinary. 50 shares, $2.20 commission, dirt in a bed on a south-facing slope, a seed pressed in by small hands, the morning light through an east-facing kitchen window. Nora looked at her daughter and the tomatoes and the garden behind her, and the hills beyond the garden and the sky above the hills, the late August sky of a Tennessee morning that was blue in the specific way of blue that is so fully itself, it doesn't seem like a color so much as a statement. She thought about $30. She thought about what $30 was and what it wasn't, and what it had been on the way to being something else, and what it had been all along to someone who knew how to look. She thought about an old woman in a small house in a small town, sitting at a kitchen table with a ledger and a pen, and a grief she had learned to build with, making a record of something no one else knew about, laying a foundation that no one else could see in the particular faith of someone who understood that the right things, given time and attention and the willingness to begin without knowing how it would end, would find their way to the surface. She thought about what you could do with an inheritance that nobody expected. Everything, it turned out. You could do everything. The seeds came up. The accounts grew. The quarterly dividends arrived on schedule, in the faithful, rhythmic way that good things arrive when someone has taken the time to set them properly in motion. Clara grew taller. The barn cat, Loretta, had 3 kittens in the spring, who grew into cats with strong opinions and independent schedules, and the complete confidence of animals who understand. They live somewhere permanent. The garden expanded, year by year, south-facing bed by south-facing bed, in the patient incremental way that gardens expand when you keep showing up to them. The heirloom varieties established themselves in the soil, became part of it, became something that the land knew. The mortgage lifter came back bigger every season, as though it understood what it had been named for and was committed to earning the name. Nora kept the ledger on the shelf in her study, beside the box with the letters and the photograph and the investing book with its 2 overlapping layers of annotation. She took it down sometimes, not to read it, but just to hold it, to feel the soft leather of the cover and the weight of 60 years in her hands, and to think about the woman who had sat at a kitchen table with it and understood, in the cold, clear way of someone who had lost a great deal and kept going anyway, that patience and attention and love, properly applied and given enough time, had no ceiling. $30. Everything. That was the distance between them, and it was no distance at all. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.